about God's foreknowledge of Adam's sin are meat and drink to him. But Leibniz betrays discomfort whenever the occasion calls for him to take a stand on the issue of human corruption through original sin. Leibniz is not a fall guy. Leibniz is clearly anxious to dissociate himself from extreme philosophers and theologians in the Augustinian tradition. Okay, I think I'll skip a little bit because we want to get on more to Leibniz. All the emphasis is placed in Leibniz's statements on the fall, not on the Augustinian vision of the corrupting effects of the fall, but rather on the Neoplatonic thesis that even the post-lapsarian human mind remains an image of God. As Leibniz says, God has made man a present of an image of the divinity in giving him intelligence. It's impossible to imagine Leibniz writing that human minds have lost their dignity and excellence before God. It is characteristic of Leibniz, rather, to criticize those philosophers such as Malebranche and even Locke, who fail to rise to an adequate appreciation of the dignity of the human mind. The contrast between the two philosophers in the area of anthropology comes to a sharp focus in the exchange of letters prompted by Leibniz's making a present of the Theodicy to Malebranche. Although he shares Leibniz's own impatience with Bayle, Malebranche overplays his hands from Leibniz's standpoint when he explains why God was entirely justified in remaining impassive, immobile, with respect to the fall. Quote, "But what," says Monsieur Bayle, "God has foreseen the sin of the first man and all its consequences. He could have prevented it, etc. Yes, but he was obliged not to do so. For by remaining impassive at the fall of man, he shows in this way that the worship, culte, of the most excellent of his creatures is nothing in relation to him. His impassivity bears the character of his divinity, which he would deny if he derived his satisfaction from some creature, however excellent it might be," unquote. Despite the fact that Malebranche is criticizing Bayle, Leibniz in reply cannot let this go. He is happy to agree with Malebranche that God was right not to disturb his work in order to prevent the fall of man. And we know that Leibniz's God cannot edit a possible world. A possible world for Leibniz is a package deal. No need to remind you of that. But Leibniz cannot accept Malebranche's explanation of why God does not intervene to prevent the fall. Quote, "I do not know, however, whether one should have recourse to this expedient of saying that God, by remaining impassive with regard to the fall of man, indicates that the most excellent creatures are nothing to him. For one could abuse this and infer that the well-being and salvation of creatures are indifferent to him," unquote. In rising to the bait, Leibniz is not quite fair to Malebranche, for in effect he misrepresents him. Malebranche does not say in his letter that the most excellent of creatures are nothing to God. He says rather that the worship of, that is, being worshipped by the most excellent of creatures, is nothing to him. Leibniz goes on to offer reasons why Malebranche himself should be uncomfortable with his explanation of God's failure to intervene to prevent the fall. No Catholic theologian will want to encourage the view that God is indifferent to human salvation. But it is clear that what really lies at the basis of Leibniz's response to Malebranche is his Neoplatonic conviction, drawing support from Genesis, that the human mind is an image or mirror of God. Leibniz cannot endorse any reply to Bayle that compromises this fundamental doctrine. Because of his opposition to Malebranchian anthropology, it is not open to Leibniz to take the quick way with the sufferings of the apparently innocent caused by natural disasters and human wickedness. Although Leibniz pays lip service to the dogma of the fall, it does no serious work in his thought. Well, that's where I should have said Leibniz is a fall guy. Leibniz then, unlike Malebranche, can find conceptual space for a genuine problem of theodicy in the narrow sense of the term. He can recognize the existence of human beings who are truly innocent and who seem to suffer injustice at the hands of their creator. But if this is so, then how does Leibniz deal with the hard cases that Rutherford parades in Malebranche's Theodicy and that tend to intrigue us today? Small, innocent children die of hideous diseases. Drawing on his experiences as a doctor at St. Thomas's Hospital in London, Somerset Maugham once wrote that no one who had witnessed a child's death from meningitis could believe in the existence of God, though Maugham did have some respect for Catholicism, I might add. And of course, we hardly need to be reminded of the fact of moral evil. Voltaire vividly describes a number of horrifying cases in Candide, and our own age can furnish perhaps even more flagrant examples. Innocent people are subject to torture and persecution at the hands of wicked dictators such as Hitler and Stalin. In this section, I'll confine my attention to cases of natural evil. One kind of answer to the problem of natural evil is suggested by a fascinating passage in which Leibniz replies to Malebranche's argument concerning the status of animals. Officially, Leibniz is still responding to Bayle, and Malebranche is not named. Leibniz writes only of the Cartesians, but as we've seen, the argument is explicitly found in Malebranche. Leibniz seeks to block the argument from the principle, under a just God, no innocent creature suffers pain, to the Cartesian conclusion, animals are just machines. Of course, Leibniz would be right that from the innocence of animals and the Augustinian theological principle to which Malebranche appeals, it does not follow that animals are mere machines. It follows at most that they do not suffer pain. It is conceivable that animals might feel no pain or anything at all, but be endowed with a genuine, spontaneous, rational faculty that is exhibited in many of their activities. Analogously, there is a gap in Descartes' argument from language in the Discourse on Method. From Descartes' conclusion that animals have no reason or intelligence, it does not straightforwardly follow that they are mere machines. But Leibniz is not concerned to make the obvious point about this non sequitur in order to block the argument for the beast-machine doctrine. In any case, in the passage from the Search, Malebranche himself does not seem to be guilty of it. Leibniz's case depends rather on making some more subtle anti-Cartesian distinctions that Malebranche ignores at his peril. Quote, I see that Monsieur Bayle insists principally on the sufferings of human beings, perhaps because he believes that animals have no feeling, and it is by the injustice that there would be in the sufferings of beasts that several Cartesians have wanted to prove that they are only machines. Quoniam sub Deo justo nemo innocens miser est. It is impossible that an innocent creature be wretched under a master such as God. The principle is good, but I do not believe that one can infer from it that beasts have no feeling, because I believe that, properly speaking, perception is not sufficient to cause misery unless it is accompanied by reflection. It is the same with happiness. Without reflection, there is none. One cannot reasonably doubt that there is pain in animals, but it appears that their pleasures and pains are not as lively as in men, for not making any reflection on them, they are not susceptible to the sadness that accompanies pain, nor the joy which accompanies pleasure. Men are sometimes in a state which approaches beasts, and in which they act almost by instinct alone, and solely by the impression of sensual experiences. Perhaps sensory experiences would be a better translation. And in this state, their pleasures and pains are very meager, mass. So in this passage, we hear of pain, suffering, and wretchedness or misery. On the face of it, then, the following distinctions may be made. 1, under a just God, animals do not experience pain. 2, under a just God, animals do not experience suffering. 3, under a just God, animals do not experience misery. Although there is some room for debate here, it seems that Leibniz seeks to collapse 1 and 2. For his purposes, the important distinction is that between the concepts of pain or suffering on the one hand and wretchedness or misery on the other. Leibniz then does not deny that animals suffer pain, but he thinks this does not entail that they are miserable or wretched. The suffering of animals is perfectly consistent with acceptance of the Augustinian principle to which Malebranche appeals. But it's important to notice that the Augustinian principle is capable of